Welcome to the Gospel and Culture Podcast. I'm your host, Ken Nerbos, and each episode I bring in guests to discuss issues related to the world's cultures from a Christian perspective. All right, joined here with Daniel. I want to use your last name just for security reasons, and glad to have you. You just finished doctoral research on the different approaches toward ministry between millennials who are expatriates working in China and Chinese house church pastors. Mm-hmm. So who'd you talk to and what'd you find out from them?
So I talked to 8 American millennial missionaries and 8 Chinese house church pastors, and basically found out that both of their cognitive models of ministry are in some ways obviously very biblical, but also very much suited to their socio-cultural context and very much influenced by historical factors. So both groups are really, in a sense, very effectively responding to their own historical and social needs.
Millennial Americans working in China are behaving like you would expect millennial Americans to behave. Yeah. Chinese house churches pastors are behaving like you would expect Chinese pastors to behave from their cultural background. So is there a difference in how they approach ministry?
Their differences are huge. Their differences were really vast. So the house church pastors, by and large, are coming from, of course, a Confucianist, interdependent construction of the self background. So tradition, upholding tradition, embodying tradition, and preserving that through facilitating conformity and imitation is super important. Whereas for millennials, coming from not a Confucian background, but a very American, very independent, they're still upholding a tradition, but they're upholding a tradition of bucking tradition.
Okay.
And so there's still conformity happening, but it's really happening. The way it works itself out is very different. And so the relationships are very independent. They're focused on independent selves. And instead of minimizing emotion for the purpose of conformity and harmony, they're focusing on emotion and experience because that's what constitutes the self. What do I think? What are my ideas? Things for this group that make them comfortable and feel valued are actually kind of threatening for this group, and vice versa.
Focusing on emotion, self, what can Jesus do for me, is empowering to an American-based pastor, or church planner, but might be the wrong questions that a house church pastor in China is asking or answering.
For sure. So an American millennial missionary or an American pastor, very, very well-meaning, would ask the question, what could Jesus do for me? And would ask of someone in their congregation or for somebody there, what could Jesus do for you?
Yeah.
So it sounds very selfish on like a surface level, but they're really genuinely caring for the other by saying, look what Jesus did for me.
And if you don't have a mark of what Jesus did for you personally, we almost see it as he's not your personal Lord and Savior. You're not as mature. So it's not just that we're being selfish. We're almost saying here's a mark of maturity, knowing what Jesus has done for you.
These are genuine markers and identifiers of the faith. You have a personal testimony.
Yeah.
Even though we might shy away from, I'm going to get up and share my testimony. Eventually, when you sit down to have a discipleship relationship as an American, you're going to bring up very personal things from your past where Christ really impacted and intersected your life. And it's wonderful and phenomenal, but it's just very different from whereas a Chinese house church pastor would look to the tradition that was modeled for him and how he overcame himself to become like that. And so you're not going to hear a lot of talk about emotions. You're going to hear talk about sin. They'll talk about their struggles, but they're usually in the past tense. But it's not something I'm currently going through and Jesus is with me in this, and whatever you've got, he'll be with you in that too. Let's be in it together. It's more of this is what I struggle with. Christ brought me through it. Now I've overcome it, so you can follow after me and imitate me. They quote Paul, imitate me as I've imitated Christ. They're really, whereas an American pastor would maybe do that, but that wouldn't be his go-to kind of text to represent how he thinks about ministry, maybe.
So is the upshot, a young church planting team comes from the United States to work in China, they should maybe continue to emphasize marks of personal relationship with Jesus, but also be sensitive to and even emphasize the importance of imitate me as I imitate Christ? Or,
yeah.
What should church planting millennials know to do different in the future?
So church planting millennials should know probably a few more things in this, but some of the big ones would be, don't have the crux of your ministry be personal one-on-one relationships. They really are everything in an interdependent community. It's a house church.
It's got to be situated in a community.
It's not we're going to go to Starbucks and have a latte together and really connect.
Which is how we see, like, you're not being a pastor if you're not doing that.
Yeah.
But you're causing disruption in a house church if you're singling out people, only talking about their walk with God.
For sure. And certainly if you're trying, Chinese Christians who come to the faith, as these Chinese house church pastors share with me, like, how did you become a Christian? How did you become a pastor? It was always leaving behind this community and joining another community. Mm-hmm. It was never, I had this one, Dr. Ken really invested in me. He came alongside me. He opened up to me, made himself vulnerable, so I felt safe to open up to him. It never really looked like that. It always looked like I saw this group of people living and behaving differently, and I wanted to be like them. And I came to them and I said, what do I do to be like you? And they had answers. So an American millennial who's planning a church, hopefully in China, would want to be very, very aware of their example. What are they doing? Are they doing things that do not look like Chinese markers of the faith? Mm-hmm. American markers of the faith are we're really vulnerable, we're really open, hopefully we're really honest, we're very personable, we don't put up walls because it would offend people, because the church is always, that's kind of what we've done here. Whereas the church is unknown. And so you need a really clear boundary to establish Christian identity. So we don't drink, we don't smoke, we stay away from those things. And if we drink and smoke, we might as well be like everybody else. And who would want to identify with us? So Chinese house church pastors are really, if we are so messy and don't have any, like emotionally, and don't have really any answers for practical problems, if we just process with people and listen and share and ask questions, if we don't have any answers, the people who are considering becoming Christians will go to somebody who has the answers.
Who just can tell them, here's how you're supposed to behave, here are the answers.
I had a group of about 20 house church pastors and about 20 American missionaries in the same room together. We were kind of discussing this. And one of the house church pastors, I made the recommendation. I said, if we're going to do ministry here as Americans, we need to be comfortable giving more answers when people ask us questions. You give an answer. And one of my Chinese house church pastors said, and I couldn't have paid him to give a better comment. He said, if you guys don't give them the answers, they will find somebody who will.
Interesting.
But we feel really comfortable with questions.
We want to seek to affirm people where they're at. Interesting. Just tell us about one of these house church pastors you met. What's the church like? What's he like?
So one of the so unfortunately with my American millennials, I had 4 women and 4 men, but Chinese house church pastors, there are tons of women actually in leadership in the Chinese house church, but I only knew one really personally. So I had 7 men and one woman. But one of the guys that I interviewed, he has a small house church that meets outside of a major campus in China, predominantly students that go there. But he is very much, even though he's in his early 30s, he has a really clear awareness of his example, the decisions he makes every single. I said, what if you could ask and get a clear answer, like what's discipleship for you? He'd say it's what a meiga. That means every single thing that I do. That's discipleship. Every single thing that I am. So I'm making kind of a community that people can identify with. And when he was in college, he had been raised up in a Christian home, but went to college and knew no other Christians there. And he had a Marxism course, so 200 or 300 people in the class. And the professor said, "Are there any Christians here?" And he said at that point, I wasn't really walking with the Lord. He wouldn't use that language. I wasn't following after Jesus, is what he would say. He would say, I wasn't following after Jesus, but I knew that I should make a stand, basically. And the professor said, "Are there any Christians here?" And he said, "I waited, and nobody stood up." And he said, "Finally, I stood up." And then the professor's response was, "Look around. Are there any other Christians?" And he said, "I was the only one." And I felt so lonely.
Yeah.
And so he put his phone number, back then things were a little different. He put his name and his phone number and said, "I'm a Christian, I'm a student here." And he put it on all the bus stops around campus.
Really?
And a local pastor found him and called him. And he put himself in that group.
Wow.
And identified with them. And so now he has this real burden for having a safe place.
Yeah.
And a safe place for us is a personal relationship where I can share and you can share. And a safe place for them is a community in which they can be like one another and be harmonious.
Okay.
But when they say harmony, they really mean they think the same, they feel the same, they act the same, they do the same things.
It's not just agreeing to disagree.
No. So, you think about his Marx professor didn't say, "You're so stupid for believing that. You're so foolish." Didn't say, "That's illegal. You can't."
Right. Just allowed him to be completely alone.
You're alone.
Alone.
You're alone because that Marx professor was no dummy. The biggest problem for the Chinese Christian isn't the government's persecution.
Interesting.
It's what group will I identify with? My social identity. It's really hard to have that without Whereas, so when I shared this with that same group of, roughly half and half Chinese, one of the Chinese women, a leader in the church, asked me, she said, "If that would have been you, and you were in America, and you had a philosophy teacher ask you the same thing, how would you feel?" And I thought, a number of people would feel different ways, but as an American, very committed evangelical Christian, I would kind of be like...
It was like being special to be alone.
Yeah, I'd be like, "Oh, I'm the only one," but it's just totally different. Yeah.
Well, thank you for introducing us to an important part of ministry, and sometimes a neglected part of missionary outreach, but a very important place in the world for us to be thinking about and adjusting our mission practices for.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us on the Gospel and Culture podcast. And to learn more, go to gospelandculturepodcast.com.